Economic growth is not an end in itself. It's a means to geopolitical power. And so it's actually, if you have to make the people poor in order to maximize the output of the state, then you're going to do that as a communist dictator.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Welcome to The New Rules with Alan Pentz, where we help you navigate today's chaos with precision. Your host, Alan Pentz, has 25 years of experience working in business and government, and he knows how the old rules have fallen apart. Each episode, we'll explore how to thrive in this new landscape by mastering the new rules while everyone else is still figuring them out. Let's dive in.
Excellent. Today on the podcast, we have Professor Michael Beckley. He's got multiple jobs. So he's up at Tufts as a political science professor, and he's the Jeane Kirkpatrick Visiting Scholar at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute in DC. He's covering 3 different states with 2 jobs. So Professor Beckley, welcome to the podcast. Glad you're here.
Thanks very much. Thanks for noting that I maximize my tax exposure. I love to support the U.S. government as much as I can, and all the state governments too.
That's right. Well, we'll get you to Texas someday, right? No state tax. So, excellent. So, yeah, what really attracted my attention, you had talked at multiple places and written multiple articles, but I saw you last at the World Knowledge Forum, talking through sort of what the 3 key reasons you see Chinese power at least peaking and starting to reverse. So take us through your basic thesis on that.
I think if you look at the economy, China's economy is already shrinking relative to that of the US, at least if you measure it in current prices, which is what you should really do, because that's how, the money that countries have on hand to buy stuff on international markets. And that's even using Chinese government data, which we know overstates the size and speed of China's economic growth. And then when you dial down into other economic metrics like productivity, which is what you really need to grow the economy, making more output for every unit of input, productivity growth has been negative for more than a decade in China. So they're spending more and more to produce less and less. And then that's resulted in a massive increase in debt. So you've seen China go from about a developing country average level of debt about 10 to 15 years ago to now debt to GDP is probably above 300% if you factor in the corporate sector, the household sector, and the government sector in China. And frankly, that's probably an underestimate because a lot of Chinese debt is off book. So it just shows that China's economic model, which worked really well when China was at an earlier stage of economic development, when it had a lot of people, it could move from the countryside and move them into factories, and they could produce for open international markets. And China had a big demographic dividend with 10 to 15 workers to support every elderly retiree. And the Chinese government was at least engaged in some semblance of reform and opening. I mean, now all of those factors have reversed. China now, you can only move people from the countryside into cities once, and China has largely done that. The international markets are closing for China, especially in the United States and Europe and in Japan. And at the same time, you have Xi Jinping and his government, which seems to go out of their way almost to really squelch private sector dynamism. They have a very state-led development model, which unfortunately for them has just fueled a lot of corruption, debt, excess capacity. It's really good at churning output out, but not really creating value either for the Chinese people or making big returns on a lot of these investments. So you've just seen an economic model that increasingly looks like it's running out of steam, and then that will eventually have knock-on effects for other elements of Chinese power. I do see China actually increasing its military power in the short to medium term, because that's typically what happens when a rising power slows down. They don't just dial back their ambitions and say, oh, we gave it a good try, and I guess we'll just accommodate to the existing international order. They usually try to make up for their loss of economic dynamism, their lack of economic carrots to just buy influence by dialing up their military power. And you're certainly seeing China increasingly wielding military and paramilitary sticks, I think, frankly, to compensate for the fact that it can no longer just buy off a lot of the opposition as countries increasingly start to become more wary of China and turn against it. So I think we're really at this key inflection point in China's trajectory as a great power. unfortunately, I think things will get more hostile before they get better, because that's what history shows us, that these peaking powers tend to get much more repressive internally at the same time that they become more aggressive internationally.
So essentially, we have these three things, right? So we had the demographics you cited, where we had multiple decades of a sort of demographic dividend, where you had 10, 15 workers for every retiree. That's slowing because of one child and just general fertility issues all across the world, really. Then you had this economic openness, where the United States kind of presided over a free trade system that allowed China to follow this export-driven model. We're seeing that starting to break down, particularly now after the election, assuming that accelerates. And then the third factor is really, well, you had cited a couple of things, I think, kind of the governance and resources within China, right? So they had this sort of, at least halting move toward reform until the ascension of Xi Jinping. And then multiple resources like coal and other things that you've cited have been depleted. And now they're importers of multiple things, including food, energy, these kinds of things. So that would basically be your main case, right, of what we see reversing.
Yeah, the fundamental point is that China's rise wasn't just the natural course of events. It was propelled by, as you say, 3 to 4 really key drivers that were very special. They were exceptional, and they're fleeting. So the demographic dividend was the result of, you had a big baby boom generation after the Chinese Civil War ends, and Mao encourages Chinese families to have a lot of children. And then in the 1970s, China reversed this course and has the one-child policy. So you had this big baby boom generation with very few children to take care of. But now that baby boom generation is retiring, and they're falling onto the backs of a tiny one-child generation. You're never going to have another demographic bubble. The resources, China, as you mentioned, has plowed through a lot of its exploitable energy resources, a lot of its arable land. And so it's gone from being relatively self-sufficient, which made growth cheap, to the largest energy and food importer on the planet. So now its raw materials are just very expensive. And then in terms of the openness, I think, China bought a lot of goodwill by kind of laying low. And then also just with rapid economic growth, it kind of feeds on itself, where because countries wanted to curry favor with Beijing to tap its massive growing market, it was easy for China to be magnanimous. And as a result, countries opened up their economies. But now you're seeing this vicious cycle where, as China tries to save its own economy by subsidizing its industries and then creating this glut of exports on the international economy, other countries, including the United States, are reacting with trade barriers and investment barriers against China. And they no longer see it as such a lucrative growth opportunity, and they increasingly see it as both an economic and geopolitical competitor. And then you, of course, have the internal, I think, decline of the governance within China under Xi Jinping, who has really consolidated power to an extent we haven't seen since Mao. And unfortunately for the Chinese people, Xi Jinping does not seem to be, he doesn't run it like a hedge fund. He's not really interested in like maximizing every percentage of GDP growth. He is pursuing big geopolitical aims and also just trying to retain his party's monopoly on power. And he'll squelch the private sector time and time again. The zero COVID lockdowns are the most obvious example, but there's been a raft of regulations that have really undercut a lot of the most dynamic firms, private firms in China, so that more money can be funneled to state-connected firms that provide the political support he needs to maintain his iron grip on power. So you've seen the reassertion of that patronage system in China.
So, there's the prognostications of China's demise have been many, right? And, you have people like Peter Zahan who've been saying, hey, they're going to collapse in 2015 and 2017 and 2020, And then you have, people like Michael Beckley not quite making that prediction, but he's been talking about the imbalanced economy for at least 10, 15 years now. So why should we believe that now something is changing that we didn't see before?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't use the phrase collapse. I don't think China is going to collapse, largely because I think the Chinese Communist Party got out ahead of that internal security issue, and they built the most massive internal security apparatus, this Orwellian police state. And so I don't think there's any prospect of an overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party anytime soon. But what I would say is, if you just look at all of those growth drivers that I just mentioned, you can, with actual data, you can show that the demographics, that 10 to 15 worker to every retiree ratio, That's going to collapse to 2-to-1 by the 2030s. 2 workers to support every retiree. The resources, you can just look at the data and see how China has totally plowed through its domestic resources. And if you look at the kind of regulations and even just high profile cases like Alibaba, Jack Ma having his entire empire dissolved and hatcheted off. I mean, that's just a sign of the times. I mean, the Financial Times just did a major investigation, and they found that startup creation within China has completely collapsed in the last 3 years because of a lot of these onerous regulations, as has VC funding. So, I mean, you can track these drivers with real data. And that's why I think this is not just people making up, oh, China must collapse at some point, or, oh, its growth is going to slow. You can actually look at it reflected not just in the driver data, but then, of course, in the bottom line economic growth statistics, the productivity statistics, the debt statistics. I think when you see it visually, it becomes very clear that this is not like, when people were talking about the collapse of China in the early 2000s, when you still had a lot of runway left in these growth drivers. Now they all seem to be exhausted. And I think, if you really look at people that are analyzing objectively measurable economic growth data, based on how much electricity is being used at night, or these various industrial indices that aren't as manipulated by the states, they all show a big collapse in the growth rate over the last 10 years. So, you don't want to bet necessarily against China. I don't think it's going to collapse, but I think the evidence is increasingly overwhelming that the epic rise that we saw from China is over by this point. And now it's settling into, a fairly standard sluggish rate of growth, which has prevailed, frankly, for most of modern Chinese history. It's really the last 40 years that have been the weird aberration from that trend.
So in some ways, Xi Jinping's actions are sort of logical, right? I mean, he might have diagnosed the situation like, hey, the adjustment to some other form of economy is very disruptive. So in order to kind of keep things going, we've got to clamp down to stay in power, essentially.
There's definitely a logic there. If you're looking at this not as some Western economist that is trying to maximize productivity, but as a nationalist dictator who wants to hang on to power and make China whole and great again, then yeah, it makes a lot of sense to clamp down, because Xi Jinping, before he became dictator, one of his jobs was to lead the Central Party School, where all the leaders get their education. And the key thing on the curriculum there was how to prevent a Soviet-style collapse in China, because they almost did have that collapse with the Tiananmen Square protests. And I think the two lessons they learned were, number one, don't do whatever Gorbachev did, do the opposite of that. Gorbachev loosened up on dissidents. He opened up to the West, and the whole ththing unraveled. So we're going to do the opposite. We're going to crack down domestically, and we're going to dial up nationalist sentiment against the West. And then second, you have to stick together as a party. You can't have different factions opening up within the party. You have to solidify and centralize control, ideally under a single leader. That seems to be the lesson that's just been drilled home to the cadres serving under Xi Jinping and through his anti-corruption campaign. I think he's scared a lot of people into compliance. And from the perspective of a dictator, I mean, you look at North Korea, a super extreme example. If you're a dictatorship, you don't have to be good at most things. You just have to be good at squelching opposing political activity, and fending off foreign threats. And the model, this fortress model that Xi Jinping seems to be rolling out, seems quite good at competing militarily with the West and then clamping down on any kind of dissent that might upset his rule at home, now that he's ensconced himself seemingly for life as leader of China.
Yeah, and one of the contentions I have is that we've not taken the Communist Party in China seriously as communists, right? And so from a perspective, like, Xi is a materialist, right? A production-oriented person. He doesn't want consumption, and he doesn't want necessarily a wealthy population. He wants to maximize material production. And that sort of weaves into this narrative of correcting the century of national humiliation, right? Like, we're going to lead in the next set of technologies so that we can use our material production to reassert China's role. So there's this weird mixing of national, his historic Chinese nationalism with communism. It seems like that's what they're following.
Right. Economic growth is not an end in itself. It's a means to geopolitical power. And so it's actually, if you have to make the people poor in order to maximize the output of the state, then you're going to do that as a communist dictator. He said, the Chinese people need to get ready to eat bitterness, which is a Chinese phrase that basically means endure hardship. He uses his own experience being sent down during the Cultural Revolution to dig ditches out in the countryside as sort of like, he put in his time, and the youth today should stop complaining about the lack of service sector jobs and should really focus on sacrificing for the nation. And then there's this overwhelming focus on science and technology, which also makes a lot of sense if you're a dictator, because you don't want to have this vibrant, crazy private sector where you get all these high-flying entrepreneurs who start to run their mouths and start criticizing the regime for, how they think the economy should be run and acquiring wealth, because wealth is power at the end of the day. It's much better if you just have really good science and technology centralized under state-owned or state-run companies so that you can get the benefits of productivity growth and military power, but without needing this pesky, vibrant private markets that could potentially form political opposition to you. You saw the same obsession with science and technology, big science and technology projects under the Soviet Union. And I think
what I was going to bring up.
Yeah, and Marxists, they love it. It's very scientific. It's all part of you can have these 5-year plans where you get certain number of patents and spend a certain amount on R&D. It's very input output sort of oriented. And so I think you're right to stress that while they may not be Marxist in the sense of like herding people into communes, it still very much is a communist organization. And I looked at people like Steve Kotkin, who's like one of the top, Russia scholars, and he got into the archives of the Soviet Union. He said the big mystery of the Soviet Communist Party is that they were communists. Like when I got into the archives, they were saying the same things behind closed doors that they were saying in public. They really believe in this stuff. And he said, I'll bet you, any money in the world that if we get into the archives of the Chinese Communist Party, we're going to find out that they were communist and they really believe this. And if you read some of Xi's internal speeches, he talks about this all the time, how communism is the way forward. That yes, you have to indulge in some private sector dynamism here and there, but at the end of the day, it's all in service to a state-led system. And you see it with the actions that he's put into place as well.
So then it would lead me to like, why would China be any more, if they've learned these lessons? I guess they learned the lessons of Gorbachev, but not of Brezhnev, right? So like, why would they be any more successful in this science and technology development push than the Soviets were, right? I mean, eventually they fell behind.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what they seem to just think that they are better at this kind of stuff than the Soviets were. There's been a big emphasis. Xi Jinping seems to think that things like artificial intelligence, robotics, synthetic biology, all the emerging tech industries that everyone talks about as being transformative constitutes something on the level of the Industrial Revolution. And so it's what scholars will call a leading sectors model of national power generation. If you can dominate the leading sectors of the economy, be the first mover, really be the one pushing innovation forward, then you are going to dominate the world. In the same way that Britain, masters the steam engine before other people, the United States masters big industrial machinery and then the computer revolution. And he has written and given speeches where he says these technologies, whatever country masters these first, is going to dominate. And so maybe he thinks that, the Soviets failed to get on top of the computer revolution, but he's smarter. He has more foresight. He's pumping untold amounts of money into these industrial sectors, expecting them to pay off and basically have that leading sector pull China along to top dog status.
So if we look at it, I mean, should we be thinking of a kind of George Kennan, do we need to set up a balancing, containment strategy? And, and I think Kennan would say that we violated his strategy, right, by getting into hot wars in Vietnam and other places. Like, is that what we should be doing? Or is the bet that China might be better? And it's a little scary to think about that. And we better do a bunch of stuff on our side, not just contain, right? We might need to invest and do all the things because when you look at it, the level of production in China, 45% of world production is much higher than Soviets ever were, I would assume.
Yeah, I think it has to be both. So, and it's going to be more difficult in some ways than against the Soviet Union, because the Soviets walled themselves off from Western markets, whereas China, if you read their growth plans, they talk a lot about leverage and about what they call choke points in the international economy. So they say, look, if we can monopolize things like rare earths or run-of-the-mill computer chips or access to finance and loans or access to the South China Sea, things other countries can't live without, medical PPE, all these things that some are high tech, some are low tech, but they are vital industries. They think if they dominate those, they can use that as leverage over other countries, precisely because China's economy is so enmeshed with its competitors in a way that the Soviet economy was not. So I think on the military side, you have to contain China, especially in the short term, because when they talk about conquering Taiwan, they are very serious about doing that. When they talk about the South China Sea being Chinese territory, not international waters, they are extremely serious about that. And that just requires straight up military power. But on the economic side, it's going to be much more difficult than in the Cold War, because China, for a long time, has gotten the best of both worlds. It's been able to tap open Western markets and open Western internet while keeping its own market and its own internet and its own networks relatively closed, in a way that allows it to maximize its own sort of mercantilist advantages in the global economy. So I think the US and its allies have been slow. I mean, now there's a lot of catch going on, but they've been very slow to plug a lot of those vulnerabilities, areas where they've gotten way too dependent on China as the main producer of, say, rare earths that we need for all the technologies that we use, and now are belatedly trying to patch those holes. I frankly think playing defense is a losing game, because China will just continue to find areas to dominate. I think you also need to have some kind of threat of offense. So there's been a lot of talk of an economic NATO, where basically the United States and its Western allies, who still at this point control more than half the world's wealth and really dominate a lot of high-tech sectors, what they can do is say, look, China, we're all interdependent with each other. And you've been increasingly turning the screw on us, waging a trade war against Australia for calling for a COVID investigation, waging a trade war against South Korea for setting up a missile defense system. If you keep doing that, there's like hundreds of vital products that you depend on that you can't live without, that we dominate. And we will increasingly use those as sanctions collectively. And we will find other buyers for each other, like we did that actually with Australia, where other countries stepped up and bought Australia's wine and its natural resources that it was selling to China. And as a result, Australia was able to ride out that trade war with China. So I think you need that economic containment in addition to the military containment, all the while saying, look, at the end of the day, China, there's always the olive branch. If you're willing to dial back your military threats, we can get back to the old order, but you're going to have to really change a lot of your behavior. I think that combination of containment and diplomacy is really the way forward. And in some ways, it's an updated model of the Kennan Cold War playbook. I would recommend my good friend Hal Brand's book, The Twilight Struggle, where he's a Cold War historian, and he shows how a lot of the same basic frameworks from the Cold War can be spruced up and remodeled for the competition with China today.
So a bunch of stuff there. So it's interesting in the sense of like, the other thing I think operating here is this imbalance in the trading system, right? And that's not just China, right? That also includes Japan, Germany, South Korea, who are also operating. I mean, obviously not on as large a scale. So can the U.S. both reshore and bring manufacturing back and keep its allies on side without, because it seems to me like the approach we're taking right now with the new Trump administration is potentially, America first.
So I think my preference would be to work with allies. I just think it's a lot easier than trying to reshore everything back to the United States. That said, I actually do think the Trump administration has hit on something, which is that in the long term, the United States has a lot of economic leverage because it's the only major economy that's going to have a growing population over the course of this century, which means the American market is only going to get more importance. Like, you need to have access to the American market as other major economies experience demographic collapse over the course of this century. Their consumer markets, their workforces, their productivity, their fiscal situation is all going to deteriorate, which just means the US is going to be an even more dominant economic actor. And I think you'll see capital increasingly flowing to the US investment. You're already seeing that, frankly. The US dominates so many of these tech sectors. I just read a draft of a forthcoming book by these Dartmouth professors where they calculated that the US controls more than half the profits in leading R&D intensive high-tech industries. China accounts for about 6%, Japan for I think 5% or something like that. Then the Europeans are so far behind, and you see that reflected in now in their bottom line economic growth statistics. So I think the Trump administration has kind of hit on something that if the United States wanted to be a rogue superpower and just slap tariffs and investment restrictions on friend and foe alike, I think it could really turn the screw on a lot of countries, and they have very limited recourse. That said, I don't think that's the most efficient way to deal with a major competitor like China. The US would be even stronger relative to China if it basically did what it did in the Cold War, which is build these vibrant Western capital, technology, and military networks where you're all trading amongst each other and gaining the gains from trade with each other and then massing that against your adversary. That to me seems like a much more promising way. It also just has the side benefit of, enriching other countries so that we have a more stable international order and it's not just like a jungle where every nation is trying to grab whatever it can. I am really worried about the breakdown of that system. I think we take for granted just how easy it is right now for many countries to plug and play with the existing open international order. If that goes away, the number of countries has quadrupled, I think, since World War II. And the only reason a country like South Korea or Singapore or even Saudi Arabia can really exist is because of an open trading system where they can buy and sell and don't have to guard their far-flung supply chains. If that goes away, I just foresee a much more conflictual world. The US may do better in relative terms, but it'll do worse in absolute terms just because the world that Americans will be living in is just more conflict-ridden, more mercantilist, more divided.
Well, in reality, America could what we have is demand, and nobody else has demand, right? Is sort of what you're saying, right? And clearly, China has no desire to create demand, so we can leverage that and should use it multilaterally to reshape the system, essentially, right?
I think the U.S. should be using that to pressure allies to. They need to pick a side, I think, economically in this, because a lot of them, they still want to maintain all these, Germany, for example, under Merkel, to trade with Putin and with Xi Jinping and that kind of thing. That, straight talk needs to happen. And I think one way to really knock heads is to remind these countries that in the long run, the United States, its market is only going to become more important for their economic livelihoods. And the technology is increasingly getting concentrated in the United States as well. And the capital markets, the US accounts for more than half the VC funding in the world at this point. So, the United States has a lot of cards to play. I just think it should use those to try to rally its allies together rather than treat them as adversaries.
Yeah. And so what do you think the Communist Party is actually thinking at this point? Because it strikes me that, you look at the example of EVs, but in sector after sector, they're taking this approach where, and to some extent, they're taking this capacity that was in the real estate and infrastructure sectors and trying to put it into export, high-tech export sectors. So at some point, that's just not sustainable, right? There's not enough. And if the US is going to cut you off, there's not enough demand anywhere, right? So how do they expect? I mean, is there going to be this moment where they realize it's not going to work? And is that like the maximum moment of danger, basically?
I think so. And I think we're quickly reaching that point because you've seen, they just sent out another stimulus package. They have no fresh ideas. Their ideas are to basically just pump more easy credit into the economy and send out more exports and invest more in these emerging industries. I think they made a big bet on the Belt and Road, which is basically a stimulus package to create demand for Chinese products. And what they thought, they look at sub-Saharan Africa, which is going to be like almost half the world's population by 2050. That's where all the population growth is happening. So I think they said, you know what, we don't always have to be reliant on Western markets. And we think the Westerners will inevitably turn on us. And everything that's going on right now, I think, confirms that Manichaean view, basically, of the international system. So I think they hoped that they could generate demand in areas across the developing world that they felt could be giant consumption generators, basically, going forward. But I think what you're seeing, unfortunately for China, is that up and down the Belt and Road, you're seeing, instead of vibrant consumption and sustainable economies and infrastructure working, you're seeing debt distress, demands for bailouts and debt relief from China, and really dismal consumption, because a lot of those economies, they just aren't able to get past very low levels of development. So I think their other bet is we'll just race out to the lead in these sectors, and if we can dominate those sectors, it'll give us leverage because other countries will be dependent on our technologies, our EVs, our computer chips, and we can use that to get better terms of trade. And we'll just reap the productivity gains from being the first movers in a lot of these technologies. I think that's a really bad bet, but I think that's what they're hoping for. And if you're reporting to Xi Jinping, the dictator, if I'm a Communist Party official, I'm maybe giving a more rosy, view of how the money that he threw my way to invest is turning out. I don't think he's getting the best economic data, and they seem to just censor any economic data that doesn't look good for them, whether it's the youth unemployment statistics or the economists warning about the problems with this economic model. That's really been squelched. And so I just wondered, to what extent does the guy at the top fully understand that this is a losing economic model, and that this almost like dogmatic faith in Marxist superiority in the long run is leading the country, ironically, in the same direction as the Soviet Union in the Cold War?
Yeah, because I know Michael Pettis has said multiple times that he sees what they're doing right now very similar to what the Japanese did, right? So that would be the Japanese were under the American security umbrella, though, so obviously kind of a different circumstance. But again, you can race ahead in certain sectors, but eventually you're going to be malinvesting at some point, right? Without any kind of market signals.
I would recommend to your listeners a book by Jeffrey Ding, who is he writes a great Substack on AI, but he also is a professor at GW, and he wrote a book with Princeton University Press. I'm blanking on the title, but it's like technology. I have it right here, actually. Technology and the Rise of Great Powers. And what he shows across the last 200 years of history is that the countries that reap the most economic gains from any given technology aren't necessarily the ones that invent them, but the ones that, what he calls, diffuse them widely across the economy. So the United States has been a master at this. So, Germany led in chemical research, in the late 19th century, but the United States dominated chemical engineering and infused all of these new innovations across its economy and turned it into what we now call the American system of manufacturing, and just reaped massive productivity gains. Same thing with the Japanese. They leapt out to a lead in semiconductors, but the United States is the one that was the epicenter of the computer revolution, because the Americans spread it widely across their economy and just infused it. So basically soaking up innovations from abroad like a sponge and then scaling them massively. That ends up mattering a lot more for long-term economic growth and ultimately growth in national power. Whereas the Chinese still seem very much wedded to what he calls the leading sector model of, if we invent stuff, good things will follow from those inventions.
Right. Yeah. And I guess one worry you'd have here, and I think you kind of address it there, is like, we've seen 15 years of sort of a Magnificent Seven bubble. We've seen quite a bit of, money pumped in from the federal government, also, the Fed. And so like, in some sense, we're looking at these economic statistics and saying, if China's so much lower, is some of the U.S. just built up on a little bit of a bubble here, and like that's going to reverse, and then we're going to go. So there's some worry about that, but I guess what you'd really look to, right, is productivity, the diffusion of technology. Those are things that aren't just puffed up by a bubble. Right.
So there's a lot of weaknesses, obviously, in the American economy. Productivity has been sluggish. It's grown about 0.6% annually over the last decade on average. That's not great by historical standards. But in China, it's negative. And in Europe, it's actually negative. So in relative terms, the US is sort of squeaking by. Debt is the same thing. American debt is massive. And now interest payments on the debt are starting to rival the defense budget. That's never a good sign as a great power. But US debt is way below, as a share of its economy, is way below China's, and seems to be sort of stabilizing. Maybe it'll start to increase again with more baby boomer retirees, but it's sort of stable. Whereas China's is just going off the charts with seemingly no end in sight. So it's not an argument that the US is necessarily nailing everything, but it's just when you look in relative terms, I just think the world, and you sort of mentioned this at the start, we're just entering a different stage, largely for demographic reasons. Populations are shrinking and aging very rapidly around the world. That's just something we haven't really had to deal with as a global society. And then at the same time, I'm really interested in this research by people like Robert Gordon and other economists who question whether some of our modern technologies, even something as innovative as AI, is going to really generate the productivity gains that like indoor plumbing and electricity and the internal combustion engine, all these inventions that we take for granted, but really propelled this very special century from the late 19th century to the late 20th century. We may just not see productivity booms like that anytime soon. Maybe synthetic biology or something will change my mind on that. But as of now, you're seeing sluggish productivity around the world at the same time you're having collapsing population. So every economy is struggling, but I think the US has advantages that cause it to struggle less than many of these other major economies going forward.
I've been trying to do some research on also demographics and innovation. And, we're probably seeing our last big generation, at least for a while, with the millennials come through. And so there's probably a great deal of innovation associated with that. And we're one of the only societies with that large group of people. So you see a lot more innovation here now, but are we going to see that starting to decline as they age with no one coming up behind, right? So,
yeah, well, that's a great point. I mean, Peter Zion makes this point that, other economies don't have a big, their baby boomers didn't have any kids, whereas the US had some kids. We've also kind of skirted by with immigration, the high skill immigration. If you look at the statistics, it's like half of our top entrepreneurs are all foreign born or recent immigrants. And so if we turn on that, that's probably not great for long-term innovation. But I do think because at least the US is projected to have a growing working age population over the course of this century, because the US system, we focus so much on like the corruption and polarization at the top, but the American system is very diffuse. It really spreads power across federal, state, and local levels, which empowers a large private sector. And then you have these really deep venture capital markets. I think that, and then the best universities in the world. I mean, that ecosystem, I think, has a lot of room to run. It may not work quite as well as it has over the last few decades, but relative to everyone else, I just see the US having its relative advantages increasing in the coming decades.
So what happens if so in some ways you could say like, all right, we've got this generation of people, we're more productive, we have the demand, things look pretty good for the US in comparison to China. Why don't we just stick and, maybe we do some deterrence, but are we going to be allowed to just stay, and not have to engage in like an intensive competition that could lead to hot war? Or how do you see that playing out going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal for the US should be to prevent near-term big shifts, like near-term victories that could radically upset these relatively favorable long-term trends. So like if things stay as they are and it's just like a stasis and it's just a marathon, I think the United States, I would bet on it every time. But if China thrashes the US military in a war over Taiwan, that can have ripple effects, because then other countries are like, oh my God, like we thought the Americans were this great superpower and they just got I don't know if I can cuss on your podcast, but they just got their asses handed to them in what they were saying was the key geopolitical theater. I mean, those kind of things matter for alignments internationally, and you kind of get this mojo. And if China is somehow able to consolidate its control there, it has a jumping off point militarily. As I mentioned before, even though China's economy, I think already basically is at the point where it's going to be at like somewhere between 0 and 3% on any given year in terms of growth. So pretty mediocre. It's a massive country, and so it can mobilize vast resources and be a big player. And at worst case scenario, it could be like a giant North Korea, and still throw its weight around militarily, even if its economy is no longer as dynamic. And so I think we have to think in those kind of terms. It's not just about whose GDP is bigger or whatever. That doesn't end up mattering that much for the overall economic or the overall geopolitical outcomes. I mean, the Soviets never, I think, gained more than half of US GDP, and yet they threatened to potentially overrun big parts of Eurasia that would have really transformed the international system and posed massive threats to the United States. So although I'm sanguine in the long term, I think that there are some short-term threats in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, from a military perspective. That means, and where the United States is actually lagging way behind, just because we don't actually invest. Even though we spend almost $1 trillion on defense every year as a share of our economy, it's something like 3%, which is equivalent to what we were spending in the 1990s and in the isolationist 1930s. In the Cold War, we spent 6 to 10%. on GDP and had these big forces. And we're also just very vulnerable. We rely on a couple of military bases on Okinawa, which China now has missiles trained on. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the United States would win a war against China, even though economically the United States, I think now is starting to outpace China again. So, we have to think like geopolitics people, not just like economists when we're thinking about national power. And so I just worry very much about a Chinese smash and grab operation that really fundamentally changes and shakes up these currently favorable trends.
Wow. Basically what you're calling for is just a doubling down reinvestment into our military capability and then on the in the South China, so we're in the Pacific, right? And then on the economic side, you see that, long term, we are going to win there, but that's not going to shift the balance of power militarily too much in the short term, right? So what else would you be saying that, if you're talking to the new Trump administration or a new administration, what would you be telling them to focus on beyond just building out military forces there?
Yeah, and I think I want to stress that it's not so much like this massive mobilization. I don't even know if the U.S. necessarily needs to spend more on its military. It's just that it needs to focus on radically different forces than it has spent the last 45 years. The F-35, these short-range fighters that will run out of gas before they even get to the combat theater, and they're just sitting ducks there on the runway, or these big aircraft carriers that are now sitting ducks for China's missiles. We need basically a high-tech minefield with drones and loitering cruise missiles. And those are actually a lot cheaper than a lot of these exquisite, almost like Baroque arsenal platforms that we continue to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in. So it may not even necessarily require lots of spending, but it does require a wholesale overhaul of the way that the Pentagon fields its forces and the way that they are going to operate. I think we're seeing in the war in Ukraine already the kind of transformative effects that unmanned systems can have, and I think that would be all the more the case in the Western Pacific. So one thing would just be rethinking how we do defense, but then the other is what I worry most about the Trump administration is the people within that may be in that administration that think that things in Europe are not related to things in Asia. So you have this big Asia first contingent that basically says, let's ditch Ukraine. Let's turn over Europe to the Europeans entirely.
This is the Elbridge Colby sort of.
Elbridge, right. Yeah, right. So he's probably the most prominent advocate of this. And let's just throw everything into East Asia. I think that's very short-sighted. And I think China and Russia certainly don't view things that way, nor do North Korea or Iran. They're all colluding together because they're increasingly functioning as an axis. And Eurasia is a continent. It's one geographic landmass. And so I think you have to think in these interconnected terms. And so allowing Russia to just overrun parts of Eastern Europe, and taking our eye off the ball there and abandoning Ukraine after they fought so hard there, I think would be a mistake, even if you might get some short-term benefits. I don't know what forces people like Bridge think are going to be freed up from a land war in Ukraine for a air and naval battle in the Western Pacific. They seem like apples and oranges to me. But even if you get some benefits from that, I think it's swamped by the longer term loss of allies, because I think the pivot to Asia needs to run through Europe. We're going to need the Europeans for the economic aspect, the sanctions and the Western defense networks we're going to need, and ultimately to contain what I view as these two allies, Russia and China, fighting back to back, against the West. They both pose major threats. And so we need to think of them as a whole rather than playing divide and conquer.
So I think I've probably changed my view on this recently, where I think formerly I thought, hey, Germany's not in the fight with us against China, right? Because that was their number one export market, right? And Europe isn't really all that threatened by China, right? Given the lack of power projection they have. But recently I've thought differently because, I think Germany is going to wake up, and I think certain elements have, and said, hey, China doesn't want to partner with us. They want to be us, right? They want to take our position. And it strikes me that these countries have no other choice, really, right? China's not going to partner with them as equals. They can only be vassal states, right? So it is potentially that they, and if we can push them hard enough, maybe they come on in the coalition. I certainly see that with Japan and South Korea, right? Because they're there. But the prospects of a Germany, I always doubted a bit.
The world can only absorb so many manufactured exports. So I don't know how the Germans think that both they and China can be these massive exporting powers. They're going to be competing for the same markets. And China has made it very clear that it's going to double down, triple down on this mercantilist model and try its best to not grant reciprocal access to its own domestic economy. And so just from a pure greedy economic perspective, it doesn't make sense to try to curry favor with Beijing when they're never going to relent, and have this situation where they're just importing tons of Volvos into China again. They want to dominate those markets. But I think, above and beyond that, I think the Europeans are starting to go through a similar evolution in their thinking, in large part because Xi Jinping decided to back Vladimir Putin in the invasion of a sovereign European country. And they're like, wait a minute, these guys aren't just competing for economic objectives. They clearly are trying to redraw the map of Eurasia where we live. And so maybe we need to start containing them together because they are operating together in that joint mission.
So I know that predictions, especially about the future, are difficult, but how much time do you think we have on this Taiwan thing?
I think so. Nothing is guaranteed, but I've argued that the moment of maximum danger is in the 2020s because, for one thing, the Chinese talk a lot about having their military ready by 2027. Xi Jinping is getting older, and he's probably thinking within his own, time horizon that he wants these kind of things to happen. But also, I just think the Chinese can see what I see using open sources, which is that you have the Americans now building up their defenses in the Western Pacific, no longer bogged down in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have the Taiwanese, revamping their defenses. You have Japan increasing their defense spending 60%, and these anti-China coalitions popping up all over the place. And meanwhile, China's economy seems to be doing worse and worse every single year. And so I think smart Chinese strategists are looking at this and saying, look, we're still going to win. We have this Marxist faith that we're going to come out on top, but we're going to have to struggle, as Xi Jinping often talks about. This is the moment of struggle. These are what he calls the changes unseen in a century. This is the moment of where the system is in flux, and we have to push hard right now to lock these things down. I think they'll never have a better chance to take Taiwan than during this decade, because I'm relatively confident that by the 2030s, both the weaknesses in China's system and then the buildup that the allies are making in the Western Pacific is just going to make it a lot harder to do an invasion or a blockade of Taiwan. So hopefully China just never will go for it. But if I had to bet, I would expect it to happen sooner rather than, a decade or two from now, just given the situation that China faces. And frankly, I just think these dictators too, they're thinking about it in personalist terms. Like, this is my moment. This is my moment to grab, to swing for the history books. I just don't see him being willing to be a transitional figure that merely presided over the eventual decline of China. I think he believes the Chinese propaganda that says under Mao, China stood up, under Deng, China grew rich, and under Xi Jinping, China will become mighty. And he's talked about how Taiwan is an inevitable requirement of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That's like his signature make America great again sort of vision for China. Make China whole again is basically would be his mantra by taking back these territories lost in the century of humiliation. He gives no indication that he's this modest transitional figure. He seems to think of himself as, the great helmsman all over again.
And so, in your view, right, and I would agree, I think the U.S. has no choice but to fight, right, at that point.
This is my big question on the Trump administration, because I think they're going to be very hawkish on China in peacetime. So I think tariffs, economically, investment restrictions, and then the military buildup. I totally see that. But I do wonder if China were to blockade Taiwan and it goes to Trump's desk and they say, what are we going to do? Are we going to send the Seventh Fleet in to blast through that blockade? Part of me thinks he wants to be the tough guy, and when his ego is challenged, he'll react violently. But he also has shown a disinclination for war and a desire to cut deals. And he's also made comments about Taiwan, like they don't really matter, and if anything, they're stealing our computer chips. And he certainly doesn't care about the fact that Taiwan is a democracy. So there is this thing in the back of my mind that just wonders if at the moment of decision, whether Trump would truly commit the United States to a war with a nuclear armed power fighting over what it believes is its sovereign territory. I just don't know about that. I think, I think the problem is the Chinese assume the Americans are going to intervene anyway. And I actually think the Chinese will strike American forces at the outset. I think they're going to take out those bases on Okinawa, because if they don't, and then the Americans do intervene, and you've just left this massive right hook arm of the US military there intact, it's going to be a much harder slog for Chinese forces. Really, your only opportunity to win is by knocking the Americans out early. I mean, this is the calculation the Japanese made, in World War II.
I was going to say, it sounds familiar, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can see how that same logic could prevail in China. So I worry that the Americans aren't going to have it's not going to be a choice. It's going to be foisted upon the United States. And that's my biggest worry, is we're going to repeat we do this all the time. We're like, we wait and we allow the threat to build and the storm to gather. And then we get punched in the face. And then we intervene in a frenzy rather than paying the insurance costs early and trying to deter the conflict from happening in the first place. I worry we're pairing tough talk and economic restrictions with military unreadiness, when we should actually be doing the opposite. We should be building up that big stick while trying to talk softly to the Chinese to make them think that time is on their side, and that they don't need to make a smash and grab over Taiwan. So hopefully cooler heads will prevail. But I see a lot of these historical dynamics building up again.
But if we didn't defend Taiwan, then I think the entire alliance network, right, falls apart over there. I mean, no one's gonna. I mean, so to your point, we probably won't have any choice. We'll be attacked as part of their assault. But if they didn't, I just don't see an option without saying, hey, we're basically going to abandon our alliance system there.
I think so. I mean, that's the most likely outcome. I don't think it's an entirely foregone conclusion, because it's not like there's that many other options for a country like Japan. There's no other superpower they can really ally with, and they're so interoperable with our forces. But I do think they'll go nuclear instead. You'll have South Korean nuclear weapon, a Japanese nuclear weapon. So I just think they'll be hedging in ways that will ultimately cause major remilitarization in the region. And then some of the smaller countries may just bandwagon with China. I mean, a lot depends on how the war plays out. If China gets its forces decimated, then maybe you don't have this bandwagoning thing. But if China, if the United States doesn't intervene, the Taiwanese lay down their arms because they realize it's hopeless, and China just absorbs Taiwan, kind of what Putin wanted to do in Ukraine, a lightning grab for the territory, then I think you're right. Then I think people are like, okay, the Americans are paper tigers and we got to fend for ourselves, or we got to curry favor with Beijing again. And I think that could put us in a completely different world than the one we've gotten very too comfortable with, I think, especially over the last 30 years, and certainly, to some degree over the last
yikes. I have to say, I mean, it is, when you talk through it like that, it does seem, I think there was a hope that the Chinese would see that it was doomed or something like that. But I do think, your analysis on the dictator and the personal issues of that and where they are, it strikes me that they probably will make the move.
I think, it's my point would just be, and my job is to think of worst case scenarios. That's my job as a defense analyst, is to figure out what could possibly go wrong and then try to minimize that risk as much as possible. It's not like I think this is super likely. A war over Taiwan, major power war, is always very unlikely. So I think, there may be a 10 to 15% chance that China decides to go for Taiwan. But, I play enough poker, and I've been in enough hands where I'm a 15% favorite and someone catches something on the river. That's way too high for me to be comfortable with. And so I think that our job is to try to get that down as close to zero as possible. And I think we could do it with a relatively modest investment in capabilities that would just make it very clear that no blockade force, no invasion force is going to survive for very long in and around the Taiwan Strait. And so Xi Jinping is going to have to find other ways to make China great again. And then, we can pay lip service to that just so he feels better about his legacy or whatever. But I worry we're not going to do it in time. We just have a long history of kind of dithering and arguing amongst ourselves.
I mean, I think most people know the stakes, and it's very clear. This more Anduril defense tech approach is obviously, there are a lot of new drone and anti-drone startups and all this autonomy and kind of moving away from the big primes has been a theme, but it's just it's like obviously this political battle in DC, who can win it quickly enough, right? And stop overproducing F-35s and move into the more modern warfare that would actually deter.
It's such a, I mean, that's the problem is the Pentagon is the largest bureaucracy on the planet. And we know from organization theory 101 that as organizations get larger, they tend to get worse because they just become so unwieldy that no one person can even understand, let alone control the direction of it. And there's obviously political incentives because a lot of these defense industries are spread across multiple states. So Congress people don't want to give up the jobs and the investment in their district and cancel a bunch of existing legacy programs just to make room for the mass production of relatively cheap. I mean, you could put cruise missiles in barges, just floating around. This is not expensive, high-tech stuff. You're just throwing the kitchen sink basically at the Chinese, the rotting cow carcass over the ramparts. I mean, like anything that will hinder and throw wrenches into the spokes of the invasion force is what we need, but that doesn't necessarily, create a lot of jobs or make a lot of money for the defense industry. And then you have the combatant commanders who love the big platforms like destroyers and aircraft carriers because a lot of their job is peacetime missions. They got to go show the flag here, they got to do an exercise there, they got to do disaster relief there. So I get it from their perspective. They need the big SUV, they need the minivan to be able to go around and do all this stuff. The problem is those peacetime activities are very different than a military geared for combat, for war fighting in a high intensity situation. And I just think we don't have the luxury, of taking our Baroque arsenal, as beautiful as it looks, and sending it into the jaws of a Chinese missile barrage.
Right. Well, and also we're not looking to make a land invasion into China, right? We're looking to deny an invasion to an island off their coast, right? So it's a different strategy, different set of equipment you use for that, right?
Exactly. We want to define victory down to to the green circle of military missions, not the double black diamond of, trying to invade things. And unfortunately for China, it does have to basically carry out the double black diamond, either amphibious invasion or a blockade, but we should utilize that in all the ways that you've mentioned.
Well, that's great. Well, I really appreciate you've been very generous with your time. If people want to reach out and get in touch, what's the best way or find out more?
My email is available online. I'm a professor at Tufts. So if you just Google my name, it'll come up. I don't do any social media of any kind. So just email me is probably the best.
It's healthier. It's much healthier. So, well, excellent. Thanks so much for your time. And we appreciate it. And we hope we got a couple of years here. So we got our act together.
I hope I'm proved laughably wrong in about 5 years.
That would be good. That would be good. All right. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Take care, Alan.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pentz. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow @Pentz. That's APENTZ on X. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.